Hello there. Do any of these sounds mean anything to you? The sounds, or specifically the instruments you heard, are what you would call sound fonts. Or are they? Well, in this specific case, technically yes, but if you're thinking about the original as you used to hear it, not really. Sound fonts are actually pretty recent. But how did we even get here in the first place? Aha, I fooled you. This video isn't just about sound fonts, it's about sample-based synthesis as a whole. So, let me quickly get you up to speed. Sample-based synthesis, or SNS, is the process of using, well, samples for the basis of your sounds. Usually, that of existing instruments. Think of it like this. If you were to sample the sound of an instrument, you could technically make songs by taking that sample and just pitching it up and down. Very early SNS used tape decks and tape loops to play sampled sounds, but this was way too impractical in actual music production, so SNS wasn't really relevant until the 70s, where computing power and storage was good enough to properly play around and experiment with the concept in the digital space. In 1979, the Fairlight computer musical instrument was released and is one of the first machines to prove that SNS can be properly utilized. The CMI is a digital synthesizer and sampler, meaning it can make, play, and record sounds. All this for supposedly mere 15,000 British pounds. In 1979. Today, that's, huh.
Fun fact, the creators of the CMI, Kirby and Peter Rockhill, were the ones who coined the term sampling.
Anyways, let's get to the benefits of SNS over other forms of audio synthesis, or other forms of making audio. First of all, it's very light on processing power. Other forms of synthesis usually use some kind of direct code or instruction written by whoever made the song, and the computer has to follow all those instructions every single time to make the desired sound, which can be pretty demanding. Secondly, it is theoretically much simpler to get into than other forms of audio synthesis. You don't need to learn math or how to code, you just need the samples. Well, for video games, you still had to sequence them, but that gets easier with software and dev kits, and we'll get there when we get there. And finally, due to the fact that it uses actual samples of the instruments, it sounds, well, much closer to the actual instruments than any amount of math could approximate with reasonable amounts of work.
We noted it. The way this and this pitch sound the band down was by actually changing the pitch of the audio. It was by changing the speed at which it plays the samples. So it slows down samples for lower pitches and speeds them up for higher pitches. This would make held notes a problem, but there's a pretty simple workaround. That is, by setting points within a part of the sample which would loop until you let go. Most also had the sample go on even after you let go, but it would fade out in volume. This is what you would call release.
However, held notes aren't as big of a problem as the minuscule sizes of storage that was available in the 70s to 80s. So, audio had to be compressed fairly roughly. In the Fairlight CMI, for example, sample rates range between 24 kHz and 8 kHz. And while that was 24 kHz, this is what 8 kHz sound like.
Hey, you sound just like me.
Yeah, but by this point, even you sound garbled, so a bit's over. Let's move on. Anyways, one of the first uses of SNS in commercial music was Peter Gabriel's 1980 self-titled album, also referred to as Melt. It's kinda hard to spot, but it is there. Apparently by this point, the musicians union actually considered a lethal threat to its members, which is pretty funny to think about now since, you know, sampling would go on to be a big part of music. Later in 1982, the CMI-2 would be released at a price tag of supposedly double the previous at £30,000. But it did allow for sample rates up to 32 kHz, which gives it much better sound quality. Alright, this is the last time I'm doing this bit for the video, but you barely noticed anything, huh? However, its selling point was Page R, which basically turned the CMI-2 into a digital audio workstation, the app where musicians make music, basically. And when space and memory became cheaper, it evolved the use of multi-sampling. You see, prior to this, most sample-based synthesis usually only uses one sample for the entire instrument. However, techniques later developed for you to assign different samples between different groups of notes so that high and low notes would continue to sound natural. You could also assign different samples for different velocities. Velocity just refers to how hard and usually loud something's played. For example, low velocity on the piano would sound like you're very gently and very softly pressing down on the keys, while maximum velocity sounds like you're mashing it. But for now, that's where I'll be leaving the topic of SNS in general music to look into video games. So, let me introduce you to the two formats that are going to be important for the next part of the video. Postcode modulation, and a variant of it called adaptive differential postcode modulation, shortened to PCM and ADPCM. But what are PCM and ADPCM actually? Well, to put it very simply, it's the method for which samples are, well, sampled and stored. PCM is used for uncompressed files, and is still used in encoding waveforms nowadays. However, if you've worked with audio, you'll know that completely uncompressed audio tends to be big. Like, really big. Which is no good for this era of technology where megabytes are treated like how gigabytes are treated nowadays. Actually, maybe it should be like gigabyte and terabyte, or maybe like 10 years ago. Whatever. So people started trying to compress it, and ADPCM was one of the formats born. Now, sampling had been kind of a thing prior to video games, as I mentioned earlier, with the CMI and some other stuff, but it didn't pick up much steam until the Amiga came around. And also around that time, video game entered the 16-bit era, where it would follow suit in picking up SNS. In the fourth generation of video game consoles, the SNES, CDI, TurboGrafx CD, Turbo Duo, Sega CD, and Sega Genesis all came around with some kind of PCM streaming. Sega was particularly fond of the uncompressed PCM format, while everyone else quickly clocked onto DPCM and ADPCM for more compact file sizes. This is why samples played on these Sega consoles sounded way clearer for the time, especially the Sega CD. Though for composing music, Sega primarily utilized FM synthesis instead of SNS. So there's that.
What's FM synthesis?
Alright, in one phrase, manually making your sounds from scratch by combining many different waveforms at different frequencies which all interact with each other. Anyways, ADPCM allowed video games to properly utilize sample-based synthesis to make their soundtracks sound much more unique. Video game music around these years were made by using sequence files which will tell the sound chip what to do. Chiptune. But for this video, we won't be talking about the beep boop kind of chiptune. This is the SNS era chiptune. I don't really know the specifics of each format or which formats were used because around this time there weren't any standards, but that's the basics of it. So the music you heard while playing those old consoles, they were all played in real time by the system, and the composers had to code the songs using text editors. However, I believe some publishers by this point started to give out development kits. Like, I think Nintendo gave out the Kankichi-kun or NSPC sequencer for SNES development. However, if you didn't get those, then tough luck. Back to Brief You Go or whatever text editor was it that you used back then, I don't know. The difference between SNS and previous iterations of sequence music is that older sound chips had limited predetermined sounds. Like having one channel for square waves, one channel for sine waves, one for triangle waves, one for noise, etc. And they, alongside FM synthesis, had to have their sounds produced in real time, which as I mentioned can be pretty heavy on processing. SNS allows consoles to emulate complex sounds with much less processing power. Now, prior to the 4th generation, samples in consoles were present in the NES, but it was relegated to having one singular channel or voice, which is not easy to work with. Not to mention, the audio quality had to be absolutely horrendous.
Big money! Big prizes! I love it!
But later, with better technology and larger spaces to work with, you have more channels and you can use samples for all of your channels. You still had to be very space efficient with your cartridge though, which is why games in this era still had to resort to very low quality and very short samples. They obviously also forgo multi-sampling entirely. At this point in video game music history, it wasn't quite time for streamed music yet, as full songs stored in audio files were way too big, even while heavily compressed. So the combination of okay quality samples and very small code instruction files proved the perfect storm for SNS. You could make gigantic soundtracks in comparison with unique sounds and quality unmatched by other game consoles, and it could all fit within several megabytes, alongside the actual game itself taking place in the same cartridge. Then came the actual games. The SNES's legacy, in particular when it comes to video game music as a whole, cannot be overstated. The legendary status of game soundtracks from, let's say, the Final Fantasy series, Earthbound, A Link to the Past, Kirby Superstar, Donkey Kong Country, are all still present today. Shortly after the 4th generation though, video game music was at a weird phase. FM synthesis and SNS were both present, older archaic sound chips hadn't been completely phased out, and stream music was beginning to take its first steps, thanks to the continuing rise of CD. It's a wild west, and having to learn all these different ways to compose music for games, none of which had any standards, was understandably a headache. So, people wanted a standard, but really only the PC crew got an answer. And even then, for the gaming space at least, it only lasted for a while. MIDI. MIDI is the new format for sequence music, primarily being developed to standardize how you call for certain instruments in a sound chip, alongside handling effects like panning, velocity, vibrato, etc. However, the samples that were being used to play the songs are handled by the system, which is why in early PC gaming, soundtracks may sound different from system to system, because each PC had different sound chips with different samples prepackaged. Of course, it worked pretty well and is even still used as a standard today in some parts of music production. And some of you may even refer to sample-based music as MIDI music. MIDI became widely used for PC gaming primarily, as I mentioned, Doom being the one spearheading the movement, but some consoles also jumped on. As far as I've dug up, the PS1 and Sega Saturn jumped on MIDI support, but Nintendo being Nintendo, they kinda just kept with their own format for sequence music, for consoles like the N64, but SNS was still the primary format for a couple more years.
Actually, Nintendo has MIDI input from all the way back in their SNES development kit.
Wait, did it? Oh shit, it did, what the fuck? Okay, look, information about retro console development is pretty easy to miss, alright? It's not really well documented. As it turns out, the SNES development kit does have MIDI input, which means you could plug in a keyboard or export a MIDI file from a tracker, and if the dev kit was happy with it, you'd be good. I'm assuming this is also the case for later consoles too, but anyways, tangent over. Let's talk about the PS1. The music of the PS1 had its own unique impact. With its use of CDs, video games could finally use stream music more viably. But sequence music still had the upper hand, as they allowed for higher quality sounds overall with much smaller space, and it was pretty much necessary if you wanted adaptive music. Setting aside the other notable sample-based PS1 soundtracks like Final Fantasy VII, Parappa, or Crash Bandicoot, the relaxing sounds of jungle from games like Ape Escape and Bomber and Hero would serve as the aim and break into the mainstream and into the memories of many 90s to 2000s kids. And then, history kept going, and as it did, sequence music began to fade away in favor of streamed music. Developers for PS2 games almost completely phased them out with very few holdouts. The Xbox was born with fully streamed audio from the start, and thus only Nintendo consoles like the GameCube and the Wii remain with its use of sequence music, and even then it was beginning to fade away outside of Nintendo games. But while storage and RAM became much more forgiving for developers of home consoles and PC games, I think a fork in the road that imposed certain limitations would create a kind of second golden era for sequence music. And it was the music of the 2000s handheld consoles. Mostly just Nintendo again though, they really like sequence music. At this point, handheld devices didn't have the best processing power or space. Games had to be light and stream music had to be compressed again, though not as bad as before. However, at this point the art of sequence music had matured, and many composers were more than willing to pick it back up for the soundtracks of games for the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS. Few did go with the PSP, but it's very few. With all that combined, the soundtracks for this niche felt like kind of a grand hurrah for the medium. It was everyone showing up with the best the format had ever seen. First of all, Patapon. You probably didn't expect this, did you? While the PSP, as I said, barely had any use of sequence music, Patapon 1 and 2 knocked it out of the park. They hid their use of sequence music very well. I don't think anyone could even guess so until WhatsApp came forward having cracked up on the sequencer format it used. It's not MIDI, but it is sequenced. These two games really show just how far you can go to blur the lines. But now, onto the elephant in the room, Nintendo. Mario and Luigi, Mario Party DS, Yoshi's Island, the Wario games, Kirby, Advance Wars, Scribblenauts, Mother 3, Rhythm Heaven. These are merely the games I could name from the top of my head. I'm a little biased, but Pokemon went absolutely insane in this era. Not only was the series the best it had ever been, the direction for art and music was absolutely astonishing. The beautiful and heart-wrenching orchestra of the Mystery Dungeon games sat alongside the musically and technically bonkers soundtrack of the two sets of black and white games. But not everything can last forever. Come the 2010s, recording and streaming music was much more than just viable, it was the standard. Everyone simply drops sequence music. It can't replicate the sounds of real instruments being played by real musicians. It was way more of a hassle than just producing the song on a DAW and exporting that audio. Most games just didn't need the special dynamic properties that sequence music had. And thus, it was left to be buried in the sands of time. For good. But sample-based music hasn't kicked the bucket quite yet. VSTs are the great new way of making music with lower budgets. But we also have another format in mind. Let's go back a little, shall we? Well, more like 20 years back, but whatever. It's the 1990s, and EMU Systems alongside Creative Labs created a format that sounds familiar but isn't quite yet what you think. The Soundfont format. However, this format was never really made public, only being used by one sound chip, the AWE32 ISA sound card. It supported the handling of general MIDI instructions such as note velocity, panning, loops, and vibrato. However, as I said, this isn't really the format we all know and love. That will be the Soundfont 2.0 format, developed later in 1996. A general refinement alongside stereo sample support. So what are Soundfonts actually? To put it simply, a ready-to-use sample library. Soundfonts are a collection of the instruments, represented by many different banks of PCM or wave samples. And it chooses samples depending on velocity and the note being requested, all of them having slice and loop information built in. Soundfonts are simply the orchestra. They don't have the sheet music to play from, and that's where things like MIDI and other instruction files come in. While the birth of Soundfonts weren't met to global acclaim, they had some niches, primarily notation software and rips. First, the notation software. While digital audio workstations mostly favored VST plugins which did everything from effects to synthesizers to attempts of faithful recreations of singular instruments, notation software didn't exactly need those. They simply needed a quick and complete bank of instruments to pull from so that composers can quickly preview how their pieces would sound when being played by a real orchestra. Sounds like a job for Soundfonts. And then there's Siva Gunner. Okay, so rips. Now, if you're a nerd like me, you may define a rip as a file extracted from a game, whether that be textures, a sequence file, or audio files, text, data, what have you, completely unchanged. But for Siva Gunner, that's not the case. Rips in Siva Gunner's terms mean that, well, the song's been changed. Usually it's mashed up with another song, but they also make great use of Soundfonts by using them to recreate the song, only to then change the melody or sometimes also the chord progression to something else. Sometimes to pay tribute, but usually just for shits and giggles. You see, when Soundfonts became a thing, people kind of realized they could rip the first definition, samples from their favorite retro games, and then they could package them all up into one comfortable little file. And while DAWs favored VST plugins, those VST plugins could be made to play Soundfonts. And in some cases like FL Studio, Soundfont is even supported natively, so the format just happened to be a pretty great fit. So naturally, people began making Soundfonts out of their favorite games, or games they thought had potential. And they had quite a lot to pick from. See, the way I covered sequence music made it sound like it was pretty short, but there are 23 years worth of games, counting from 1987 to 2010, the era they were most relevant. And there are many with those legendary stylus soundtracks. And thus the land of rips, the second definition, lived happily. People shared their own rips and made fusion collab type projects, where you and others mix and match songs and Soundfonts and styles, and it's all really great. In my opinion, these really showcase each artist's understanding and love for the original media. Let's put a pin on that for later. For now though, it seemed like this was all Soundfonts were going to be. There were going to be nothing but a format known only by people who use music notation software and people looking to make video game rips, the second definition. The only notable blip that appeared was Porter Robinson's Worlds, an album that is nostalgic in nature with a lot of low-budget sounds, many of them reminiscent of old sample-based music. But while the album highlighted the older sounds, it didn't garner much eyes to the concept. A year later though, it would make a surge to the spotlight and saw because of one annoying little dog. Robert F. Toby Fox. Does he even need an introduction?
Just do it anyways.
Okay, let's just make this quick then. Undertale, unique RPG, unique story, minimalistic graphics, and most importantly, for this video, a very Soundfont-heavy soundtrack. In particular, a lot of Earthbound. When Undertale practically took over the internet and only took off further from there, people began to look into this whole new Soundfont thing that Toby used so much. And lucky for them, the internet has become a goldmine for these. Now let's pull off that pin from a little while ago. Collab fusions. People showed off their understanding and love for multiple titles by mixing and matching their Soundfonts and compositional styles. So what if we just did standalone versions of those? And what if it extended to other categories of music? I'm guessing you've seen the results of these more and more recently. X song but in the Super Mario 64 sound font, song from X game but in the sound font of Y game, S game style remake of Y song with X sound font swaps. And thinking about it, yeah, these are basically just rips, but they're distinctly different, so I'm categorizing them in a different way too. And now we return to the start of the video. Are these really sound fonts? Well, I mean, yeah, I did recreate them using sound fonts, but the original is not so much. There hasn't really been a widespread or catch-all term for a collection of samples like this, as most games typically just let them all sit in the cartridge somewhere, I don't know. I believe that and the availability of sound fonts nowadays is why we all gravitate towards the term sound font, because it's the first thing to really bring these together and help bring the format into the mainstream. And now there are technically two types of sample-based music. In one side you have VSTs attempting to mimic real sounds as well as possible, while on the other side we're also seeing many people return to the era of sequence music for their sounds. New titles like Pizza Tower and Ultra Kill emulate this 90s to 2000s style of video game music very well, and also put their own spin on it, primarily electric guitar. And the Mdoku's works on the Terraria mod Calamity has many uses of sound fonts. Sample-based music is now at a time where people who would be nostalgic for these kinds of things are able to pay respect to them and make works that stand on their legacy. Look, if making a whole video about it hasn't made it very clear, I absolutely adore sound font-centric music. I use sound fonts in my music pretty much whenever I can, not just because of nostalgia, but because these are genuinely good tools for newer composers who don't have the money for all those $500 VSTs.
What about the legality?
Well, the legality of it isn't clear, which is a bit worrying, but I mean, it's not really enforced either. If Toby Fox gets to make a whole career out of it, who's to say you can't? Well, I just hope it stays that way. So, sequence music. It evolved into existence both due to innovations and limitations. The samples it brought with it continue to thrive due to their effectiveness. While sequence music is no longer the standard, I think we can all agree it holds a very special place in the history of video game music. Samples, however, are still a big part of music in general. The instruments you hear in a song, especially if it's for a game or made by a single artist, is likely not recorded. They're more likely VSTs, but unlike the VSTs, sound fonts aren't there to trick us. They're there to remind us of an era of music that was brought on by limitations, as are many creative solutions. So, in short, this video is just me gushing about sound fonts, sample-based music, and sequence music. They've all had their shares in the spotlight, but sound fonts have quite the future ahead of it, with all the buzz surrounding it nowadays. And I'm really happy that's the way it is. I don't know, man, I just wanted to make a video about sound fonts, and I may have fallen down a rabbit hole while researching for this video. And now I don't even know what video this is. Whatever, I'm just gonna go now. See ya. Hello there. Thank you again for watching my video. This has been a big one. I've been waiting a long while to do, but I never really felt ready to tackle it. But after the last video on level editors, I thought, well, might as well just give this a shot, you know? And again, I'm not really a sound engineer or a historian in video game music, so if I got anything wrong, then feel free to correct me in the comments for free internet points. I'm gonna be taking a break for the rest of the year, but I'm gonna do the good old tradition here on this channel and make a video commentating on my stuff as a whole and talking about my future plans and also my other projects, you know, outside of this channel. So, yeah, thanks for sticking by, and I'll see you guys in December. Peace.